This first slide, I wanted to highlight a couple things before I got into the principles. And as you'll note that this is one of those thin stands from density management. And those of you with a good eye for vegetation can see that where I'm standing is in a patch of Devil's Club. And I am actually at the head of the water at that location. You'll also note that you can see the ridge line at the top here. So here we have this headwater stream that is very far up in the watershed, and from a size scale, these things are tiny. So Sherry and I were talking about this when we were asked to do this, and we thought we'd summarize, given there might be managers in the audience, principles of headwater system aquatic biology. And note I say headwater system. This is something that when I was working on headwaters and I did a synthesis with John Richardson, we highlighted the fact that these things truly are systems, and it's inappropriate to really look at it as just a stream in a riparian area. So the four principles we came up with was, first of all, in this system, there's tight linkages between the forests and the streams. And secondly, that hydrology is important, the magnitude and the duration of the stream flow. And also, topographic influences. This becomes extremely important in the variety of headwater streams, which are going to be much more variable than some of the larger streams and rivers, for example, that Kelly just spoke of. And then in the role of disturbance. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give some examples of some work that we've done in each one of these principles, and I'm going to highlight, since this is the West Side story, 9 pieces of research that are very close to here, local, and I'll list them at the end. So the first principle is this linkage between forests and streams, and we need to understand that materials and energy cross through these systems in all directions. Upstream, downstream is common sense, this direction water's flowing, and from the riparian to the stream, we know in these headwater streams allochthonous inputs that are coming from the riparian areas are more important. But work recently from a variety of researchers, including Andy Moldenke from this university, we've been seeing energy and materials crossing from the stream to the riparian. This is sometimes called reciprocal subsidies. So the work I did in Agenda 2020 was on density management sites, and we had 3 treatments: clear-cut, thinned, and mature, and I'm going to give a couple examples from that. And we all know that once you remove the canopy, insulation is going to increase. And these bars are from left to right, from mature stands through thinned. These will be the density management thinnings and clear cuts. And what we have on the y-axis is insulation as estimated with HemiView software at the summer solstice. So it's no surprise to anyone that there's a lot of sunlight once you remove the canopy. But note, in these thin stands, there wasn't that much of a difference. So one result that I found a little surprising is we were looking at periphyton production, that again, the sites are from mature on the left to clear cut on the right, is that we see the clear cut streams have some healthy production, but the highest production was from the thin sites. And what was happening here is, in the clear cut sites, the production was probably limited by something else, perhaps nutrients. We didn't take it that far. But though the algae in those sites didn't have to work very hard. Whereas in the thin sites, according to my best estimate, in which we discuss in the paper, is these algae are probably producing more chloroplasts because they're working harder for the lighter light and actually being more productive. Now, Charles Frady and Sherry and Judy Lee did some work up in the H.J. Andrews looking at old growth and young growth. And in this slide, we see 4 seasons of density of macroinvertebrates. And those pairs are a old growth site and a young growth site. And as you can see, this was 20, 30 years after the harvest, that there was very little difference in the densities of macroinvertebrates in these sites. So what this suggests is even with clear cutting, eventually there will be a return. So there's a whole lot of resilience in these systems. Now, with respect to these reciprocal subsidies, this is another case of the system. It's most commonly discussed when we think about salmon coming back and the carcasses returning nutrients, and folks like Cedar Home and Bilby have described that very well. But in headwater streams, recent work, Sakuro Nakano from Japan has done some very good work in this area, as well as Andy Moldenki, seeing that these emerging insects are very important to the bird communities. And in fact, Andy went as far as to suggest that the returning neotropical bird community was keying in on the various hatches at various times. I also did some work in the Kalapuya looking at upstream and downstream linkages, and what we did is we were interested to see how far aquatic insects were drifting at base flow as a potential source for fish food. And half our sites were blocked and half of them were not blocked, and what we found is in this slide we have the blocked and the unblocked sites in 4 sets of stacked bar diagrams in which the bars are orders of insects, and the 4 sets are weeks of sampling. And the key thing I want to present here is we found very little difference between the blocked and the unblocked streams during base flow. And what this suggests is this aquatic community that's drifting is local. So there's, again, a tight link between upstream and downstream, and these insects may not be drifting very far. And so those are a couple examples of the system of the stream in the riparian area. Now here's a quiz for those of you that know your caddisflies. There's 4 here. You can tell me which ones they are later. Now the second principle is the magnitude and duration of stream flow. And those 18 sites that I worked with on the Coast Range, and we're actually going to go to a couple of them tomorrow, I think. We're going to Green Peak. All of them were stream fed, spring fed. And what I mean by that is when we walked up to the top of the stream, we were able to tell precisely within a meter of where the stream started. Now, that would be very helpful from a management standpoint, but it's also highly variable. I can't say that all the Coast Range streams are spring fed. In fact, Janelle Banks, who did work over in the LC not that far away, did not find that they were all spring fed. So there's a high amount of variability. But what spring fed means is that means there's going to be water flowing all year. But in those 18 spring fed streams, there was a range in base flow yield, so that there was variability there as well. We could see some of them with just a trickle, but some, when you went out there, it was literally like seeing your garden hose running. There was quite a bit of water flowing out of these springs. So again, this is another example of the high variability of these headwater systems. But one other note about the hydrology that I think we don't appreciate in these headwater streams is much of the water is flowing through the hyphoreic zone, and it's moving slowly. Note on the y-axis, that's minutes per meter. Now, if you were out and you're in your boat on the Willamette River here, you'd see the water moving a couple meters per second. Well, in these cases, in most of these streams, and in some of them, it took more than 2 minutes for the water to move 1 meter, very slowly moving through these systems. Now also, given the amount of flow changes from spring to base flow, if we look at the macroinvertebrates during different times of the year, you can see at base flow there's much less abundance, less biomass, richness. EPT is the stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies. so that there is a large change seasonally in these small streams. And I told Sherry we don't want to do an ordination, but she at least let me do a cluster analysis. And the point here being is you can see the base flow, the B's versus the S's, the spring samples, broke out very cleanly except for one overlap. And the distance along the x-axis tells us how different the communities are. So that you can see in spring, most of these communities in all these different locations were very similar. They were highly similar. The same organisms were found during those samples. But when we went out in base flow, there's a wide amount of variability. There's a whole lot of change in these communities as flow declines. Now the third principle, topographic influences. And if you work in the Coast Range, you probably assume it's entirely Tyee sandstone. Well, I took our geologists out to our sites and asked them to look at some of the rocks, and he was finding basalt in almost all of these supposedly sandstone sites. And what we hypothesize is there's these basalt dikes and sills that are being intersected by these stream channels as they move through the landscape. So I think it's another source of variability that we underappreciate. Certainly elevation and aspect. Another piece of Andy Muldanky's work is he found that elevation was more important driver of emergent insect communities than harvest activity. So elevation is very important. And we all know with aspect, the north versus the south side, there are major changes in thermal regime. Now, on those 18 Coast Range sites, we broke up the gradient as to whether it was a non-drop grade or a drop grade. And what we have in these headwater streams is a step-like structure. So this creates a lot of variability. When I go out and sample for aquatic insects, I'm looking for a flat spot so that I can get my gear in and get a sample. But we can see that in these small headwater streams, there's a lot of vertical habitats that are very much unsampled and likely sources of habitat for organisms that I'm missing when I'm looking at the flat stretches. Now here's a picture of a diatom to give you a sense of scale. That's 10 microns. And we looked at the diatom communities in these 18 sites, and you can see they're mostly this anacanthid diatom up to close to 100%. And the way this diatom makes a living is it attaches itself to hard substrates. Well, you can see in the 4 sites where it wasn't very prevalent or almost absent, those were the sites that had the highest amount of fine sediment. So in these headwater streams, substrate conditions are driving a lot of the community composition, and they're highly variable, and as we saw from Dan Miller's talk, subject to disturbance. But here is one of these things that you publish and you expect you're going to get some feedback on, and let me explain this slide because I think it's amazing. In the 18 sites that we sampled in the Coast Range, we had approximately 120 taxa. And the way it takes a while to get used to the way I displayed this data, but on the y-axis is the number of taxa, and on the x-axis is the number of sites it was present. So what this is showing us is that 42 of the 120 or so taxa were found only at one location. And if I were to go to, say, some of the streams that Kelly just talked about, and someone asked me what the benthic community was, I could reel off 10 taxa that I know would be there. But in these headwater streams, if we go to the other side, to the right side of that graph, only 7 of those taxa were found at all 18 sites. This is a tremendous indication of the high degree of biological diversity that is potentially in these headwater streams. Now, my sampling here was very limited. The flows were so low that when I got there, I realized my standard equipment wasn't going to work. So I had a choice between taking water to the stream or the stream to water. And what I chose was bringing the stream to water. What I mean by that is I excavated and carried substrate back out and later went through it. So it was a very limited sample. If I were to go back and look at, say, some of those vertical habitats, some of the habitats under pieces of wood, habitats along the edges, I expect that I'd find a lot more aquatic macroinvertebrates. And here is a picture. In fact, this is the picture that was on the cover of the Forest Science special issue that a few people have mentioned already. But this gives you some idea of the complexity that we're seeing in just one stream. Or remember that these streams drain probably 80% of the landscape. So there are hundreds and thousands of these streams, all with a lot of highly variable characteristics. So the fourth principle, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think we've spent adequate time on disturbance in this meeting. But we know that there is fire and there are landslides, and we know that the time scale might be in centuries. But in these headwater streams, it doesn't take much to have a disturbance. Just think about that one year where there's a heavy thunderstorm in August. Well, that's probably going to have enough flow to mobilize the bed. That's going to disturb that community and reset it. And on the other side is drought and low flow. In these streams, whether they're spring-fed or an intermittent stream, if we have that 1 year in 10 where it's very, very dry, aquatic organisms need water. So that is going to be a disturbance that is going to reset the community as well. So in summary, headwater systems are tightly woven. Secondly, changes in canopy alter community composition and perhaps accelerate biological cycles. What we really haven't had a chance to investigate, and all the studies that I talked about with the involve maybe 20 sites. So it's very difficult to make large inference over large areas when you only have such a small site. But if you look at, if clear cutting is going to warm the water, that means at a particular time it's going to be warmer, but over the course of the summer, if you think of degree days, that could accelerate some of these cycles, so that these connections perhaps between emergent insects and neotropical birds may not connect as easily. The systems are resilient. Frady and Johnson found that after 20 years that they were very similar. And even after, if I went back to our clear-cut sites and some of the sites that we're going to visit tomorrow, from 5 years ago, I would expect that they're going to be, if you were to compare them again, they would be very similar. The range of habitats across the landscape likely create rich headwater system biota. And of course, as a scientist, even with this recent spate of research, I think these systems are very much understudied. And I think if we were able to find the funding and really go after biological diversity in these systems, I think we'd be surprised at how really rich they are. And here's some of that work that I talked about.
Time for one question.
Go ahead.
Time for one question for Bob.